Thanks. So you have up to 10 minutes to make your presentation. Following your presentation, members may want to ask you some questions, and then we'll go on to hear the second deputation, and then we'll consider the report to which you're speaking.
Councillor Perry, I would like to thank the committee for agreeing to hear our deputation today. We are here to comment on the report that you'll be considering on reducing child poverty. Our deputation consists of myself, Des Lockley, as Secretary of Edinburgh TUC, and Alison Murphy and Claire Robertson, who are EIS delegates to Edinburgh TUC. You'll each make a contribution of about 3 minutes, and we'll be pleased to answer any questions that the committee might have. The current concerns of Edinburgh TUC arose when we read media reports of a food crisis in Edinburgh. Food banks are being overwhelmed by rising demand due to so-called holiday hunger and the impact of universal credit. There were delays in receiving universal credit, and the amount allocated represents a cut in benefit from what people were receiving before. We were concerned about what seemed to be a worsening situation. It is shocking that a significant number of children and their families are going hungry in a prosperous city such as Edinburgh. We read the report on reducing child poverty. It seems to us that the statistics outlined in the report are a significant underestimate of the scale of child poverty in Edinburgh. We believe that councils need to be aware of that and to seriously consider that more resources need to be allocated to deal with the true extent of a deteriorating problem. Surprisingly, the report states there are no official Scottish Government estimates for measuring poverty at the local authority level in Scotland. This means that the Council seems to have to rely on the data analysed by UK organisation End Child Poverty Campaign. The report quotes figures from the campaign, but they do not seem to be the latest figures as quoted in a campaign report published in May 2019. The Council's report states that about 21,000 children in Edinburgh live in poverty, whereas the End Child Poverty Campaign now quotes a figure of 23,023. The Poverty Campaign lists a number of constituencies in the UK, 28, where child poverty has increased by at least 5% in a year. 2 of these constituencies are in Edinburgh, Edinburgh Central, Edinburgh North and Leith. The data of the campaign was gathered for the year 2017-2018, so it is quite old. It will not take into account the impact of universal credit, which was introduced to Edinburgh in late 2018. We think that the figures quoted in the report detailing the ward statistics for child poverty are possibly a couple of years out of date. Being pre-universal credit, they must represent a significant underestimate. The End Child Poverty Campaign makes a prediction for the whole UK that by 2022, child poverty will have increased by 33% from 3 million to 4 million. We think that there has to be a question about actually the figures, as they are all subject to consideration of housing costs. It's not clear how the high housing costs in Edinburgh have been taken into account. That isn't mentioned anywhere in the Reducing Child Poverty report. We are particularly interested in how the key figure for the poverty level of a two-parent family with 2 children has been calculated. We think, from what we've read, that the figure of around 21,000 quoted by the Council is much too low. We are concerned that the Council's Child Poverty Action Unit will not be able, with the current allocated resource, to do enough to mitigate child poverty in the city. At best, it might be able to somewhat reduce the predicted increase in child poverty. We think that the amount allocated to the Discover project of 250,000 per annum is far too low. If there are over 23,000 children in poverty in Edinburgh, that sum of money is not going to go very far, even if it is solely used to deal with holiday hunger. The Council should be talking millions rather than low hundreds of thousands. A Council spending of 3 million would seem to be more like it. The Council's report states the Scottish Government has developed guidance for the contents of local child poverty action reports. It requires that the Council identify new action to reduce child poverty or expansions or modification to existing action to increase impact. We think that the report does not specify any action that actually reduce child poverty. At best, it might slow the rate of increase in Edinburgh. Now, my colleague.
Thank you very much. Myself and Claire are both obviously going to speak particularly about the implications as regards schools. I think we'll start by saying that we welcome the report and we welcome the intentions behind it, but we do have many concerns. Des has spoken in detail about some of the statistical issues. I'm going to highlight a few broader issues around schools, and then Claire will speak much more, as I say, about specifics of what teachers are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. One is around a real issue of stigma. In a time of limited resource, I can understand why help is often very targeted, but the problem with that is then children become embarrassed to access it. And every teacher in every school will tell you about that. And in your report, you talk about the fact that there is poverty in every part of Edinburgh. Well, in schools such as the ones I taught at, where you do have a very mixture of children right across the range of, from very affluent to incredibly, disadvantaged, even things like getting kids to have school meals, free school meals, is very difficult. You're on a trip, how do you actually get the child to agree to have that? Because their peers can see they're doing it. So targeted funding is an understandable reaction, but it has real problems. And actually considering very much how we get the children in mixed areas to be able to access support, to be wanting to do this, is incredibly important. There's also a real issue with short-termism. And again, from my own personal experience, projects that you start, I was very involved in summer schools a few years ago, and we set up a summer school. We had a lot of funding. We were able to make it available to all children at a really good uptake because we had funding from a project. 2 or 3 years in, the funding is reduced, and then the funding is cut. And you are left with the choices of, do you scrap the whole thing? Do you reduce and reduce? And one of the things that we had to cut was actually being able to provide lunches. Do you fund it out of school budgets? There is no funding. Or do you start charging? So you immediately start to disadvantage the most vulnerable children. And I doubt there will be a teacher in the country who wouldn't be able to quote something where a project started with the best of intentions, and then once it's up and running, the money goes to the next thing. And this is a real concern with PEF funding, because that is, again, something that is time limited. So there's lots of good work being done in schools, but we're really concerned about how long it'll be sustained. I think I've already circulated to the committee electronic links, but there is a lot of research that the EIS has done on facing up to child poverty. And so I have brought hard copies, homework, if anyone would like those, and we'll leave those there. But we would urge you to both be looking at that, but also very keen that we are involved in all the different committees going forward and the work that's being done. So the EIS, but also other unions. It's really important that you're hearing from teachers, but also PSAs, from other people in schools, that these are represented, as well as the children. A key factor is going to be time. We obviously talk about resource and we talk about money, but you need to actually provide time for people in schools and in other areas to be able to work at these things, to be able to build relationships, to be able to look at research, to be able to talk to each other. Without time, many of your initiatives will not work. I'm also going to do a couple of quotes. This is a little bit random, but entirely separately, a few days ago, I was sent a final draft of a friend of mine who's doing a PhD, and his particular research focuses on youth workers and children from disadvantaged areas in Scotland. And the particular bit I think is very important is about youth practice. And he's talked about issues around the fact that if you have a tight focus just on, say, poverty or employment, you actually miss much bigger issues of social justice generally. And in fact, you end up often maintaining issues, because if you focus on, say, employment without looking more broadly, you start trapping people in a series of short-term jobs. He also said, to quote for the practitioners, practitioners working with young people. As many writers in the areas of youth work argue, it is an ethical requirement that practice supports young people towards addressing injustices impacting on their lives. This study finds that the ability of practitioners to respond to the issues of injustice in the lives of young people is compromised by a performative landscape centred on meeting preordained targets and outcomes. The interviews with the practitioners were, for the most part, unfavourable and pessimistic regarding their ability to respond to issues of injustice. The major themes that emerged out of data are a lack of necessary resources, the impact of ever-tightening outcome-focused practice, the focus of the positive destinations agenda, an ever-increasing workload of paperwork, and the impact of working in partnership. All of these factors are limiting the ability of these practitioners to start where young people are at. So we were really pleased to see that the whole report started with Councillor Dickey quoting a child, but keeping the children at the heart of it, ensuring that we are actually able to be responsive and not being really target-driven is going to be absolutely central. At the point where this research actually does become publicly available, which should be very soon, again, I'll be happy to share that with the committee. But at this point, I'm going to hand over to Claire, who can give you a much more sort of powerful testament about what's really happening in schools.
As a primary school teacher working with children who live in decile 1 and 2 of SIMD, my colleagues and I are faced with challenges relating to poverty daily. Our school has had to develop many support strategies to meet the needs of our children that are not being met in the home. Our children often come to school hungry and appear very tired. Lateness and school absence is widespread throughout the school year. Some of the children appear dirty and clothes are often unwashed or inappropriate for the season. Before Christmas and towards the end of the final term of each school year, the level of anxiety rises. Children's behaviour changes. Some children find coping in class very challenging and experience episodes of tiredness, with some children requiring a quiet area to sleep during the school day. Crying, lashing out at others when they can't cope with the tasks presented in class. When behaviour escalates to being unsafe, calming down opportunities are used when children need to be removed from class. We know that much of this anxiety comes from financial pressures felt by parents. When we reach out for supports from outside agencies, we find 6 months waiting lists for children referred to CAMHS. The ESL service has diminished. When we refer to visual support team, the literacy dyslexia team, our educational psychologist or our cluster ESL leader, we know our children will need to wait before specialist teachers and resources are available due to the growing needs across the city. No new children were given audit hours at the beginning of this year. We see changes in behaviour patterns for parents too, picking up children late, asking for support with applications for free school meals, housing benefits, other benefits, and we see changes in family structures and aggression towards our staff. Many parents are working at more than one job, but 0-hour contracts stop them from being able to make a change. Families living in private rented housing often must pay very high levels of rent. 5 families were evicted in the last school session from our school. This affected 16 children. 4 families had to move out of the catchment area, requiring a change of school. 1 family had disability payments and supports temporarily stopped as they were placed outside the city. 2 years ago, when we had to close the school due to adverse weather conditions, on returning to school, we were shocked to see the children at Breakfast Club eating breakfast with 2 spoons out of 2 bowls, as they had had no food since they had left the school. Although there is a local food bank which is only opened once a week, so the school staff can contribute to an in-school food bank which can be accessed by parents. We witnessed children's physical development being delayed, nursery children attending using nappies without the vocabulary expected at that stage and not being able to grow at the expected rate. Mental health is affected for many of our pupils, lacking the communication skills and using the counselling service at school to share their feelings. We try to support parents that are under so much pressure financially that they feel they can't go on. Parents' mental health is affected, which in turn affects their children. Poverty is an adverse childhood experience for many of our pupils. In many respects, we are the first point of call for parents and a front-line emergency service for families. In 26 years of teaching, I've never experienced the level of need facing our schools and families. Teaching in such an area requires real commitment to support children and their families. We're not only trying to raise attainment against this background, but to foster links with families who are difficult to reach out with school. It is stressful and difficult to be faced with children living in poverty. We feel a great deal of pressure to teach the children the skills they need, but often we find that what the children need much more is nurture, love and understanding.
Okay, thanks very much. Are there any questions on that? Claire, there's one thing in terms of your presentation that clearly exercises quite a bit in here in terms of what you're faced with and what schools have to deal with. And there's a real question about whether schools are the right place to deal with some of these issues, or they should be dealt with before they come to school. And my understanding is that more and more schools are expected to take on more and more of the types of behaviour you're talking about. What's your view about the split between that? Should we expect schools to sort these problems, or do you think there's some other mechanism that should be there and schools shouldn't be able to deal with that?
I definitely think there should be supports in place for parents before the children reach the school. When the children come to nursery and they're so far away from being able to pick up a pencil, obviously there's a lack of experience and knowledge that the parents have and what they need to do with their children to bring them up to be ready for school. We have a play-based pedagogy in primary 1 because the children are not ready to sit down at tables and chairs. They need to be able to play. And because they haven't done that before they come into the nursery, it's meaning that the children, their development has been, it's slowed. It's different from how we used to teach the children.
Can I add? Just to add something to that, I think the other problem that we have is absolutely schools. The job of schools is learning and teaching, and, you know, we've got a focus on raising attainment, we've got a focus on all these other things. But exactly as Claire said, kids need nurture before they can do these. And what's happening at the moment is children are coming in, and we have no choice but to try and pick up all those other pieces, because the kids are there in front of us. So you absolutely have teachers, PSAs, the whole school community, all the staff, doing things that everyone would agree isn't their job, but no one else is doing it. And I mean, only yesterday I was in a school where we were having a meeting about, and I was supporting members about support for one particular child, where the reason this child is acting out in school is everyone is agreed about problems at home, but when they contact social services, this child does not meet the barrier, the criteria for social work support. It's not severe enough, even though it's very severe. But this children's in school. So everyone has no choice because the children are there in front of us. And this is happening all the time. So we are picking up huge amounts of things that, yes, shouldn't be our job. But the kids are there. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I think it's mentioned in the report quite a bit that precarious working has to be tackled too. And I think that's very true. I mean, whatever statistics say, they have no guide to what a family will earn in 2019 or in the future. So, for example, whatever someone is earning in terms of an hourly rate, a lot of people in the city, if they're on zero-hour contracts, don't know what they'll earn the rest of the year. And if they're off ill, they revert to SSP. And so I think there's a whole area there that the council is tackling it up to a point, but that's dealing with precarious employment and encouraging good practice in employment, I think, is also an essential part of tackling child poverty.
Alison, you raised that the unions are very willing to work with the council on this, and I was wondering, was any union representation solicited for the Child Poverty Action Unit?
Not that I'm aware of. Did anything come through the TUC? What? For the Child Poverty Action Unit? No, we have worked with some of the specific groups within the children and families, so some of the school-focused ones, but not, to my knowledge, for the unit itself. I could be wrong.
And actually at that point I was actually going to bring that into what I was about to say. I think my feeling is that child poverty is one of the most absolute important topics. I don't think it's high enough in the agenda in this council and across the city. I think there's a complete lack of understanding about what exists. I think every single one of us should be weeping about the child poverty that exists and its impact. Where we're at right now is there's a report, as you can see, it's coming forward. That is just the first one going to the Scottish Government. There's a Child Poverty Action Unit that has been formed to try and join up, to make a difference by joining everything up. So that's a very recent formation. I'm the chair of that. For me, it's absolutely clear that, that children, lived experience, frontline should be key to, driving that action forward. And cut the bureaucracy, cut everything else there, get the actions and scrutinise the delivery. So at the moment I'm actually, writing to the Chief Executive and asking how are we going to embed that, how are we going to do that. But that brings me to Mary's point as well, as we're at the point of actually establishing the membership and the best people to drive that forward. So I'd be really grateful if, for instance, Claire, EIS can actually send in your the list that you would like to see in that, to see how it tallies, to join it up, but actually to advise on who best would be sitting round that table. Let's get to lived experience, let's get to frontline. They know best, they can sort it. And so I'd be really interested if you'd be keen to do that.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for coming in and giving your deputation. I've got quite a specific question. In the past year, the Council has cut funding for referred breakfast and after-school clubs in some of our most deprived areas. And the argument has been made that, well, the provision at schools will replace the services provided by those community-led organisations. I wondered if you had an opinion as to whether that was appropriate or an additional burden on schools that cannot be met.
Of course it is an additional burden on schools. Our breakfast club is funded by Greg's and another private company. So we've reached out to companies to try and to ask for help to support them so that they are free for everybody who needs a breakfast. But it's teachers that are having to do this. When they should be dealing with learning and teaching, they're having to change their job to try and reach out to people to support the children that are in front of them.
I'd absolutely add. It sounds so simple, but I'm sure you're all sitting around this table because you are people who get involved in all sorts of different things. We all know setting up things like a breakfast club, it sounds very simple when you sit here, but it takes a bit of time. It takes a bit of effort. Well, the time to do that is time you're not spending on other things. And as we've said before, one of the absolute crises that we have in schools is that every one of us is working far more hours than we should. And you cannot teach well, and particularly you cannot do the emotional labour that's needed to deal with these incredibly vulnerable children if you've been working a 45 and 50-hour week. You're just too tired to do it well. So something like that sounds quite simple really isn't. Not to mention the fact that great that Greg's in place, but A, is it appropriate? And B, even if it was, there are only so many private companies and we've got a lot of schools. And again, if you only do this in the schools in the private areas, there are children in poverty right across the board. Every school in Edinburgh.
If I was asking you what is your preferred structure for putting breakfast clubs in, would you be outsourcing them then to private companies or anyone else, or local companies, or? Personally,
in an ideal world, I would like it to be something where in each, and again, I suspect there may be probably a mixed model in different schools. Okay. Because you'd need to think about journeys in some schools where kids are going in a long journey, it might be more appropriate that actually you have a range of breakfast clubs in community hubs where they then have social workers or youth workers taking a breakfast club and using that to bring the children in. In some of the more concentrated schools, you probably actually do want it in the school. But again, you want it run by people who have the time to do it. Now, personally, I'd be saying we have an awful lot of extremely good practitioners and youth workers in the council. They would, to me, seem to be the ideal people to be doing it.
Okay. Any other questions? In that case, thanks so much for your deputations. Leslie.
Thanks, Convener. The second request for a deputation is from Scottish Youth Climate Strikes. Were the committee happy to hear this deputation as well?
Is that agreed? Thank you very much.
Thanks. So we have Sandy Boyd here today from the SYCS.